Okay, Michael Chong, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Great to be here.
Uh, I want to take a quick minute here at the beginning of the interview to do a little armchair psychiatry. How's it going? How's it going in the conservative caucus room in Ottawa these days?
Well, we've obviously had a number of two members of our caucus that crossed the floor to the Liberal Party, and so obviously that's not something that we would have wished for, but it happened.
Mm.
Um, and so that's these things happen in parliaments, particularly minority parliaments. So it's not something that's entirely unexpected. I've witnessed many floor crossings over the years. And so this is yet another two that have taken place.
I wanted to dig a little deeper in that because I found this thing you wrote in the Hub back in I think it was May,
Hmm.
and you've been pretty active on the file of electoral reform and parliamentary reform, and
Yeah.
you raised this note that you're struggling with the erosion of like the power of the essentially the power of the backbencher, the power of the pure
Hmm.
parliamentarian. This kind of thing probably doesn't a lot, and we could make a lot of talk a lot about as Mr. Polyev has said, like backroom deals to get to a majority. But I mean, just generally in terms of like the efficacy of like how Parliament works, it doesn't do a lot that you can move MPs around like chessboards and get political power that way in terms of enhancing the ability of everyday MPs, so to speak, to use their own authority in Parliament Hill.
Well, look, I think that MPs have to be accountable to their constituents. And what I've witnessed over the years is that many MPs who cross the floor aren't do not have the support of their constituents to do that, and constituents have the opportunity to pronounce on those things in the subsequent general election. And so, in some cases, MPs go on to have uh, the support of their constituents, but in many other cases, they don't. And often that's expressed at the ballot box in the following election.
Hmm. Speaking as someone who's been endorsed at several elections now, I want to dig into some of the stuff on the foreign affairs file, which is you are the foreign affairs critic for the Conservative Party. I just want to talk very generally about what the Prime Minister's been doing. He's been certainly logging a lot of flight hours, whether that is, these trade missions or meeting with fellow world leaders. But in terms of how successful you think Mr. Carney has been in terms of advancing Canadian interests, economic interests, political interests on the world stage. What are your sort of general thoughts about his accomplishments so far?
Well, I think we should measure him by his own commitments, by what he said he was going to do. And on that measure, the results have not been good. He promised in the last election that he would get a deal with Donald Trump by July of this year, and that did not happen. Um, he promised, to do a number of things related to domestic policy that have not yet happened. And so, on his own measure, he hasn't fulfilled the commitments he made in the last election. Now, I think the prime minister is still in the honeymoon period, and I think most Canadians are giving him the benefit of the doubt to sort things out. But he'd better start delivering results, in a short period of time in the future, or else I think the country is going to turn on him for having failed to deliver on what he committed to do, which is to turn our economy around and get things back on track after 10 years of the Trudeau government.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I want to just float an idea that sort of rattles around in my head, which is, um, does Donald Trump want a deal? Like, and like, what does, to your mind, because you've lived through this before in a parliament that was it locked in trade negotiations with
Mhm.
Donald Trump, but like, does he want a deal? Because it seems to me like he wants the drama, uh, more
I
than a
don't I
deal.
don't know, Adam. It's a short answer to the question. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows what he wants. And anybody who says they do, I don't think they know what they're talking about. Um, I think, though, that the bigger question is whether or not we're going to take control of our own destiny here within our own country.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's arguable that we've done more damage to our own economy over the last number of years than Donald Trump could ever do. And
Hmm.
I'll just highlight one statistic
Sure.
to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. In the year 2000, Canadian exports globally, including to the United States, measured as a percent of our GDP, was about 43% of our GDP. Over the subsequent 2.5 decades to last year, uh, the share of our economy that is being exported has dropped by 10% to about 33%.
Hmm.
That is a fact. And if you compare it with a second analysis done by, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, for example, or by economists like Trevor Tombe at the University of Calgary, they estimate that the maximal damage, if the Trump tariffs are fully implemented, would be about 2.5%
Hmm.
of GDP that would be eliminated. And so if you look at what's happened over the last number of years with our exports falling from 43 to 33% of our economy, and you look at what the Trump administration could do maximally to damage our economy, it is a convincing argument to say that we've done much more damage to ourselves with our own policies, with our lack of interprovincial trade, with
Hmm.
the regulations that have been put in place that have essentially blocked a lot of major investments from taking place in Canada, a lot of major natural resource projects. When you look at what we've done to block competition in this country, that all has led to an economy where we're not exporting as much as we once did because we could become so competitive.
Hmm.
And, I go back here to give you another uh, data point of
Sure.
what I'm talking about. In the year 2000, our number one export was from the secondary sector of our economy, from manufacturing. It was automobile exports.
Right.
That's been displaced now by exports. The number one export now is from the primary sector of our economy, from commodities, from the commodity sector. It's oil. And so we're moving down the value chain in terms of our exports. And I think that's in part because we've blocked that we've blocked that we've become uncompetitive, both internally, but also internationally. And I think if we're going to deal with the challenge that the Trump administration is presenting us, it starts with us getting our own house in order, making our own domestic economy much more competitive, much less hampered by regulation, so that we not only sell more stuff to ourselves internally, but we also can export to markets like Asia and Europe.
And to your point though, that's sort of like what Mr. Carney sold himself as being like an experienced economist and banker, and theoretically, and theoretically too, it should be easier to take down tr barriers between provinces than work out new trade agreements on the fly, whether that's with the United States or with anybody else for that matter.
Yeah, and I think, look, we have lots of trade agreements in place already with economies other than the United States. We have the free trade agreement with the European Union. We have a free trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific region through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have dozens of bilateral free trade agreements with countries in, for example, like Colombia and Latin America. The problem is we're not taking advantage of those agreements to the extent that we should.
Hmm.
And that has to do with a lack of competitiveness within our own economy, but it also has to do with a lack of trade infrastructure. Our ports are poorly ranked in terms of efficiency. Our transportation infrastructure to get our merchandise goods and commodities to ports is in need of an overhaul. And so, I don't see a lot of movement on that front from the Carney government to improve either competitiveness internally or trade infrastructure. What we have seen to this point is a lot of doubling down on the approach of the last 10 years. So, for example, instead of in the last budget overhauling our corporate income tax system to make our the business environment for companies a better environment for them to invest and grow. We instead have things like accelerated capital cost allowances for
Mm,
certain targeted sectors. We have, federal government funds that are being set up to provide support for other industries rather than doing the heavy lifting of reforming our corporate income tax system, our business regulatory environment, and domestic competition policy in order to create the conditions for a much better business environment for companies to invest and grow in. So, uh, that's a problem. I don't see the government moving quickly on. And the second problem is I don't see a lot of focus on enhancing trade corridor infrastructure. You
mm,
know, the World Bank, I think just about 3 years ago, commissioned S&P Global to do a study of the world's top 350 or so ports. And they wanted to rank them in terms of efficiency. And the Port of Vancouver is Canada's largest port. It's our gateway to the Indo-Pacific. And out of the 350 or so global ports that were ranked, Vancouver ranked second to dead last for efficiency.
mm.
And so, we've long known now about the problems with trade corridor infrastructure, and yet I don't see a big focus on the government to clear that up. This is one example your listeners would readily understand. We're one of the few advanced developed economies that don't have a national highway system.
Mm.
You cannot, and by highway, I don't mean a two-lane road like Highway 7 or Highway 6. I'm talking about a limited access, four-lane divided 400 series type highway. We don't actually have a highway like that from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. And we're unique amongst advanced economies like this. Pretty much any country in Europe has multiple highways like that. You can drive across the European continent on highways like that, across the United Kingdom on highways like that, across the United States on their interstate system. We don't actually have this highway. If you wanted to drive from Guelph, Ontario to Vancouver, you cannot drive through Canada on a four-lane divided limited access highway. You're
Right.
going to encounter on the Trans Canada dozens, if not thousands, hundreds of intersections and stoplights. You're going to encounter literally thousands of driveways. Um, if we're trying to get our goods to international markets efficiently, we need to have a proper highway system, proper trade infrastructure system, and then ports that can handle that.
Yes. To get him into downtown Toronto from Guelph, you're talking about making the transition between like three or four different major highways as it is. Um, I like all of this. I like talking about these big things. But I mean, the practical reality is we're talking about generational change, and then that's what how Mr. Carney phrases it as well is big, massive change that will take years to realize. And I think people listening to this are like, Michael, this is all interesting, but you know what? Can the grocery store, the grocery bills, Michael, the grocery bills, and it just curious, like in terms of like when you're talking to constituents about these things and talking about the big ideas, whether it's the things Mr. Carney's pursuing or the things you wish Mr. Carney was pursuing, people want relief right now. And so how do you propose to sort of create that right now? What are the things you would like to see Mr. Carney do right now to give your constituents, including Guelphites, I would add.
Yeah,
You represent a part of Guelph too. How
yeah.
do we develop that immediate relief?
Well, I think there's three things that the Carney government has not done that I think we should be doing. First, we need to drive down taxes. Taxes are too high. The growth in government over the last decade has been huge in Canada, and we need to drive down taxes for working families and for the middle class. There have been tax cuts, but they're not. What we really need to do is we need to overhaul not just the corporate income tax system that I talked about earlier. We need to overhaul the personal income tax system
Mm,
with the goal in mind of doing broadly two things: broadening out the tax system so that everybody pays their fair share, and reducing the rates, reducing the tax burden. And I think you can do that by broadening it out and by eliminating a lot of the deductions and loopholes that currently exist. And that involves, like I proposed on the corporate side, an overhaul of the personal income tax system. The second thing we need to do is we need to increase wages, and that's done through increasing growth,
Mm.
increasing business investment, increasing the willingness of companies to expand here in Canada. And I think that involves, in addition to corporate tax reform, I think it involves an overhaul of our regulatory system. Our economy has become overregulated. Things take too long to get done here. They are too expensive to build, and it takes too long. We also need, in the third bucket of things we need to do, we need to increase competition. When you look at the banking system, for example, the
Mm.
telecom system,
Mm-hmm.
our airlines,
Mm-hmm.
Canadians know that things aren't competitive because they talk to people in other countries and they find out how little they're paying for their monthly cell phone bill, or how little they're paying for banking services, or how cheap it is to fly within Europe, for example, or within the United States. And so, we need to, tax reform, we need regulatory reform, and we need competition reform. And those things can have an immediate effect of helping make life much more affordable for Canadians and increasing wage growth.
You're not a flat tax guy, are you?
No, I'm not. No,
Okay.
I
Interesting.
believe that there has to be some progressivity in the tax system.
Okay.
I think people who are well off should pay a little bit more in order to ensure that we can afford the social programs and the healthcare system that we've become accustomed to. But our tax system now is completely broken. Look,
Mm.
we had a major overhaul of the income tax system in 1971. That was a
Mm-hmm.
result of what was then called the Carter Commission. Uh, it introduced things like capital gains taxes for the first time, and so many other changes to the system. The second big overhaul took place during the government of Brian Mulroney in the mid 1980s. For example, he took 10 federal income tax brackets, and that government reduced it to three. They replaced the onerous manufacturer's sales tax that was hurting Ontario's manufacturing industry, and replaced it with the GST.
Right.
They overhauled other parts of the tax system. Um, it's now time, uh, several decades later, to have a complete overhaul of the system. Again, there have been
Mm.
economists like Jack Mintz that have been proposing to do this. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has proposed this. I think it's long past time for us to take a look at it.
Carter Commission's a deep cut even by this show standards, but I do want to get to to back to foreign affairs because I don't know if been sort of brought to your attention, but somebody's been putting up posters around the south end of Guelph with your face on them, essentially like wanting you to take a stand about selling like armaments and weapons to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And we're here recording a couple of days after there's this horrid anti-Semitic attack in Australia. There is this real kind of friction between, wanting to be critical of the way Israel's prosecuted the war in Gaza, and at the same time recognizing that anti-Semitism is on the rise. It seems that at least some of your constituents in Guelph feel like you can have a role in that. So in terms of like finding that middle ground, in terms of
Mm-hmm.